Road to Revolution. So we have seen how Mexico was making an effort to populate Texas by allowing Anglo settlers into Texas. We have seen how Stephen F. Austin had brought the first 300 Anglo families in Texas, the old 300. And they had done a good job learning Spanish and becoming Mexican citizens and becoming Roman Catholics and building up Texas agriculturally. And we had seen how the Mexican government was so pleased they granted Austin more land contracts as an impresario, but also they granted other impresario contracts as well. Sadly, as we'll see today, some of the other Anglos coming to Texas were not quite as interested in obeying those rules as the old 300 had been. Of course, also at this time, of course, Texas was part of Coahuila y Tejas, with the state capital way down south, more towards Mexico City than Texas. And of course, Texans were a little bit angry at that, but the Mexican government said, once you get more people, of course, we might consider making you your Mexican state. And as we'll see, that sort of might happen as we go along and get more people. So the problem perhaps was that in Mexico City, ever since the Mexican Constitution had been written, the Mexican Constitution of 1824, the Federalists had been in power. The Federalists who favored sort of strong state governments and a sort of a weak central government. However, the Centralists, who of course basically just thought the other way, they thought that a strong national government was the most important thing. And even though you could have a state, that basically those state governments would be very weak, and they basically have to obey orders from the national government. So eventually a new centralist government would gain power in Mexico and start imposing new rules on settlers in Texas, which would increase tension between Texans and Mexicans, between people living in Mexican Texas and people living in Mexican Mexico. One of the first sort of disagreements was a dispute over a land grant that the Mexican government had given to Mr. Edwards to bring settlers into Nacogdoches area. But when Mr. Edwards arrived, there were already some settlers there. Of course, those settlers had originally been Spanish settlers. And of course, when the missions were closed, they were told to come to San Antonio. But if you remember the story, those settlers decided just to stay and eventually established the city of Nacogdoches on their own. And so those people were still there. And supposedly, Mr. Edwards, under his land grant from Mexico City, was supposed to sort of acknowledge those people and let them stay there. But Mr. Edwards, of course, was going to be making his money off selling land. And so basically, unless you could actually absolutely prove with a piece of paper that you had been there since Spanish times, Mr. Edwards was going to make you pay for the land that you'd probably already been on for many, many years. And that angered many of the locals. As more and more people arrived, they decided to hold a little election for the city council, the town, the mayor of Nacogdoches. And the election led to a dispute, basically between the people who'd already been there and the new Anglos that were arriving there. Eventually, both candidates were a little bit upset and basically asked sort of the Mexican governor to sort of intervene, and he did, but basically Mr. Edwards and his group were not really satisfied with that intervention, and so they start displacing people who had been living there, and in fact they start actually deciding to create their own little area there, which they would call the Republic of Fredonia. Republic of Fredonia. So that was originally a Mexican land grant to Mr. Edwards, but now Mr. Edwards and his friends basically were proclaiming sort of an independent area, basically to get their way. But and Mr. Edwards and his followers thought that Austin and his settlers would come to help them out against the Mexican government, but in fact, Mr. Austin and his settlers actually sided with the Mexican government. So once Mexican troops started to arrive near Nacogdoches, Mr. Edwards and his friends, who sort of proclaimed this country, this new republic in Texas, they fled. They ran away to the United States. So the Republic of Fredonia was very short-lived, and really the only thing it did was create tensions with the Mexican government, who now had doubts about these new Americans that are arriving. I mean, after all, if these new Americans are going to be, trying to take Texas away from them, why should they allow Anglos and people from the United States to come anymore? With that in mind, the Mexicans sent an inspector to the area to see how things were. By the time the inspector arrived, of course, Mr. Edwards and his group had run away. They left their nice little flag, which said independence, liberty, and justice. Of course, the Mexican government was not too pleased, again, with this little revolt, even though most Texans did not support it, and certainly not Mr. Austin or his friends in the colonies here in Texas. So during this time period, Stephen Austin helped the Mexican government in the revolt. And again, you might suspect then the Mexican government would say, oh, this is just a small group of these Americans that try to, create this independent republic. So, we'll just let it go. But instead, they sent over an inspector to see, well, again, if this American group was sort of rebellious, maybe some other groups were rebellious as well. Eventually, this inspector reported back to Mexico City, and as a result, the Mexican Congress issued a new law, the law of April 6, 1830, which encouraged Mexican European families to immigrate to Texas, but stopped immigration from the United States. And naturally, Anglo settlers in Texas did not like the new law because it affected their ability to make a living and bring family and friends from the United States. So again, things at this time were going pretty good for the Anglo settlers that had come from the United States, which had, of course, been in this sort of Great Depression, this panic of 1819, which brought many United States people to Texas looking for opportunities, and they found some good opportunities, some good agricultural opportunities here in Mexico. So many of them, of course, wanted to bring their friends and families to this new area so that their friends and families could make money as well. But now, under this new law, immigration from the United States was cut off. That is, no more Americans would be coming into Texas. Of course, naturally, that's going to anger the Anglos already in Texas. It also banned bringing slaves to Mexico, the same law, and added taxes to all foreign goods coming into Mexico. Of course, since Texas was part of Mexico, that would mean that things that if you were a Texan and you were having things brought into Texas, you would have to pay a tax on it to the Mexican government. Now, even though the law actually banned slavery in Mexico, they never enforced that law here in Texas. They would, however, try to enforce that tax law. So, first of all, immigration, people coming from the United States, that was now a no-no. And also bringing stuff in from the United States and overseas was now going to cost you a lot more money. Those two things were going to really anger some Texans. Of course, looking at the map, you can see these settlements in Texas. If you want to pay particular attention to Anahuac, which you can find on your map, because that is a place where there is going to be some trouble. So at Anahuac, a very loyal Mexican who had fought in the Mexican War for Independence, Colonel Bradburn, even though he was from Virginia, he was very loyal to the new Mexican government. He tried to collect taxes on imported items. And when two lawyers, including a guy named Mr. Travis, tried to use some legal persuasion and some other methods to stop this collection of taxes, Mr. Bradburn had them thrown in jail. And the fellow Texans did not like that very much. And so they gathered up a small group of people. They marched to Anahuac, and they actually captured some Mexican soldiers and basically said, hey, Mr. Bradburn, we'll trade these Mexican soldiers for the 2 prisoners you have in your jail. And Mr. Bradburn said, okay, we'll make that agreement. And so the people from Texas released the Mexican soldiers, but then Mr. Bradburn did not release the 2 lawyers. So that made the Texans a little bit angry, even more angry than they were. And eventually a little firefight would break out in Anahuac, a little skirmish. Realizing this little skirmish in Anahuac might cause the Mexican government to doubt Anglo-Texan loyalty. That is, the Mexican government might look at this little skirmish, this little firefight in Anahuac and said, oh, I guess all Anglos in Texas are just like those people. So in 1832, sort of delegates from different parts of Anglo-Texas got together at a place called Turtle Bayou and issued some statements called the Turtle Bayou Resolutions. First of all, they said they were loyal to Mexico. They basically said those people at Anahuac, they don't represent us. They're not us. We're peaceful people. We're happy to be part of Mexico. We don't want to be independent like that Republic of Fredonia in Nacogdoches. So don't blame us. We're loyal to you. Also, we heard there's a sort of a new guy, new president guy in Mexico City, and we like him, a guy named Santa Anna, because he promises to be loyal to the 1824 Constitution of Mexico, which was a federalist constitution, which gave the federal government less power and the states a lot of power. And the Texans there at Turtle Bayou says, this Santa Anna guy, he sounds good because he's going to obey the Constitution. He's not going to try to take power from us and do bad things to us. So they never got around to actually doing much with the Turtle Bayou resolutions. But once they proclaimed their loyalty to Mexico, and Santa Anna did come into power, the Texans got together again in 1832 and got together to issue some more resolutions, some more statements of support for Mexico. And in 1833, they got together again and formally sent these resolutions down to Mexico City. And in 1833, they asked that people from the United States be allowed back into Texas again. They wanted to be exempt from paying these taxes on things coming into Texas called import taxes for 3 years. And they also wanted Texas to be its own Mexican state. Now that Texans had a lot more people than they had when the Spanish left, Texans are saying, hey, we have a lot more people. We have enough people for a Mexican state. Can we be our own state? In the meantime, we don't want to pay these import taxes, and we need more people to come in. Please allow more of these Americans to come into Texas because we're loyal to you. We're loyal to Mexico. Now, Stephen F. Austin took these resolutions down to Mexico City. Unfortunately, when he got there in early April, there was a lot of disease going around. The government had sort of left the city so it wouldn't catch the disease. The new president, Santa Anna, had not come to the city yet. So he could not actually deliver these resolutions from the Texans because there wasn't anyone to give them to. So as he waited around for some government officials to arrive, he talked to some other people, and he said, and those people told him that probably the new government would allow Texas to be their own Mexican state. Now, he didn't get any official approval, but the people he talked to seemed to think that the new president would allow that. So Stephen F. Austin then basically wrote a little letter back to Texas saying, hey, why don't you guys start forming a temporary state government? I think we're going to get some permission here to make Texas its own state in Mexico. So why don't you guys start sort of forming your own temporary government? And that way, when Santa Anna gets back and okays it, then we can have our official state government. Eventually, Santa Anna did get back, and he agreed to allow Texans to resume bringing people in from the United States. and he agreed to think about allowing Texas to be its own state. And in the meantime, he would divide Texas up into 3 districts, which means Texas would have more votes in the Coahuila y Tejas legislature, the state legislature. So Austin thinks, you know, this is a pretty good deal. So Austin starts to go back home. He gets as far as the Coahuila state capital, where he finds that his letter a couple of months earlier had been intercepted, and the government had sort of read his letter and said, what? You said for people to like form a state government? We didn't give you permission to form a state government, you traitor. And so they basically took Stephen F. Austin to jail, and he would be there for a while. In fact, eventually his trip to Mexico City would last for about 2.5 years, a lot longer than he thought. Meanwhile, Santa Anna kept his promises. He, first of all, recognized English as an official language in Texas, along with Spanish. Of course, remember, some of the new immigrants never learned Spanish to begin with, so this was more of a practical matter than anything else. He also allowed immigration to resume, so people from the United States can now come into Texas. And he also allowed freedom of religion, so you do not have to become Roman Catholic anymore. Plus, again, he allowed Texas to have 3 representatives in the state legislature of Coahuila y Tejas instead of the 1. And so it looked like, you know, Texans would be pretty happy with this. And most Texans were very happy with this. And for a time, it seems like Texas and Mexico would sort of work their way, and all the anger would go away, and you know, Texas would remain loyal to Mexico. Again, looking at the chart down there, Colombia and places like Anahuac, a little more trouble. Sorry. So a little more trouble at Anahuac, thanks to the Bradburn guy down there trying to collect more taxes. He actually basically told ships coming anywhere near Anahuac, even near the Brazos River, that they had to come all the way to Anahuac to pay their taxes. So that did not sit well with many people, because even a sailing vessel took many days to get to Anahuac from maybe the mouth of the Brazos River, and many days back. That's going to add many, many days to the voyage of the ship. Plus, of course, you are now paying import taxes. So a few Texans in Anahuac sort of disagreed with what Bradburn was doing, and again, this sort of led to a firefight, led to some shooting, and at which point, even though, again, Texans wrote, in this case, Austin's colony, and Stephen F. Austin wrote directly to the general in charge of Texas, General Coss, and said, oh, we are so sorry. We're so sorry for those nuts in Anahuac. You know, don't blame us. It's just a few people in Anahuac. We're still loyal to Mexico, and we're so sorry that they shot at your Mexican soldiers. We're so sorry that, you know, they sort of bullied your Mexican troops there. You know, that we totally disagree with what happened at Anahuac. But nevertheless, General Coss was not very happy, and he demanded that the Texans who caused trouble be arrested. And not just arrested, but tried by the military courts. Not the civilian courts, but tried by the military courts. And of course, because General Coss was sort of the leader of the military in Texas, naturally the case would get to him, and probably those people would be executed. Unfortunately, this did not sit well with Texans. I mean, even those people in Austin's colony, even the old 300, having a trial by the military was very strange to them, very foreign. It seemed like a real threat to everyone's liberty. So the town leaders of Columbia called for a meeting called a consultation in 1835 to start to talk about things, about, you know, what should we do in response to this general wanting us to turn over arrested people to him for a trial. Town leaders of Columbia, Texas, called for this meeting in 1835. Texans broke into 2 parties called the Peace Party. That is, let's not even have this meeting. I mean, just having this meeting might, like, make the Mexicans even more suspicious of us. and the War Party. And the War Party was basically saying, let's have the meeting. They weren't saying go to war at the time. They were saying, let's have the meeting and discuss these things and show the Mexicans, they just can't push around. So by this time, Stephen F. Austin is making his way back to Texas, and the Peace Party is very hopeful that when Stephen F. Austin gets here, he'll, because he's always been in favor of peace with Mexico and the Central Mexican government, that he'll put a damper on things, and the meeting won't take place, and tensions will go down, and everyone can live in peace. Unfortunately, when Austin gets back, he's actually in favor of the meeting. Because after all, spending 2.5 years in jail for basically a crime you didn't even commit has led Austin to believe that the new government in Mexico is no good, that they are going to do bad things for Mexico and bad things for Texas. And Stephen F. Austin is even suspicious of the new president, and he believes the new president is more of a centralist, more of a person who wants all the power for themselves and will take that power away from Texas. So Stephen F. Austin, when he gets back, he calls for the meeting as well. So tensions are rising in Texas, thanks to some tax disputes, thanks to sometimes people taking the law into their own hands, and sometimes taking non-peaceful approaches and taking sort of more violent approaches to try to get their way. Tensions are rising between the new settlers, the Anglo settlers of Texas, and the new central Mexican government.